In the hills of Appalachia, families lived in shacks pieced together from rough lumber and tin, often without plumbing or electricity. Bathing meant heating water on the stove and pouring it into a metal wash basin on the floor. Children fetched water from creeks, and winter drafts crept through every crack. Life was hard, but folks took pride in making do with what they had. In coal country, the dust never left you. It coated homes, laundry, and the inside of your lungs. Miners came home black from head to toe, washing up in basins before supper. The pay was small and the danger constant, but the mines kept food on the table. Families learned to live with the soot and the sound of distant dynamite echoing through the hills. Many poor Southern families still relied on outhouses tucked behind the house. They were simple wooden sheds over a pit, cold in winter and swarming with flies in summer. People kept lime nearby to sprinkle for the smell, and an old catalog served as toilet paper. Nobody thought much of it. It was just another part of country living before plumbing reached every home. For single mothers, money stretched like thin rubber. They sewed clothes by hand, patched shoes with glue, and paid bills face to face at the counter to avoid overdraft fees. Payday meant breathing room, if only for a few days. They managed with quiet dignity, juggling every nickel. Pride often kept them from asking for help, even when the cupboards were nearly bare. Kids often wore the same clothes for years, hand-me-downs from cousins or older siblings. Knees were patched, buttons mismatched, and faded colors told their own stories. Mothers turned worn shirts into dresses, old coats into vests. You didn't complain. You were just grateful to have something that fit. In the 1960s, new clothes were a luxury few poor families could afford more than once a year. Government surplus food came in plain boxes marked USDA commodity. Inside were big blocks of cheese, powdered milk, canned meat, and flour. It wasn't fancy, but it filled bellies. Local churches and welfare offices handed them out each month. Families lined up quietly, grateful yet uneasy. That food kept people alive through lean years when there wasn't much else to rely on. Public housing was supposed to be the answer, but by the 1960s, many projects were already crumbling. Broken elevators, peeling paint, and crowded hallways became normal. Still, for thousands of poor families, those apartments meant shelter from the rain and a place to lock the door at night. They weren't pretty, but they were home, and home was a luxury. Cars weren't replaced, they were repaired endlessly. A single vehicle might serve a family for decades, held together with baling wire, duct tape, and sheer determination. Flat tires were patched until the rubber gave out, and oil leaks caught with tin pans underneath. When it broke down, you prayed it wasn't too far from town. Those cars were lifelines, fragile, smoky, and vital. When food stamps first appeared, not everyone had them, and those who did sometimes felt ashamed using them in public. In towns with the new program, checkout lines fell silent when the colored coupons came out. Out in the country, people still depended on surplus food handouts instead. Pride ran deep, but hunger ran deeper, so you swallowed one to fight the other. For poor children, getting to school often meant walking miles down muddy or dusty roads. Some carried lunch in old syrup buckets. Others went with none at all. School buses didn't reach the farthest hollows, and shoes wore out fast. By the time they arrived, clothes were damp and dusty, but they sat straight in class, proud just to be there. Winter nights in poor homes were a battle against the cold. Wood stoves burned scrap lumber, cardboard, or bits of coal scavenged near the rail yards. Families gathered close under blankets, warming hands and telling stories. Ice crept along window panes from the inside. Heat was precious, but so was togetherness. Survival wasn't easy, but somehow everyone managed to get through. Bath time was a family ritual. A single tin tub sat in the kitchen, filled with hot water from the stove. Father went first, then Mother, then the children in order of age. By the end, the water was gray and lukewarm, but nobody complained. It was part of life before running water. Clean enough was good enough when times were lean. When money ran short, the power company came knocking. Lights would go out for weeks at a time, and candles or kerosene lamps took their place. Kids did homework by flickering light, while mothers cooked on gas stoves if they still worked. Electricity wasn't guaranteed. It was a privilege. But even in the dark, families found ways to carry on together. For many families, income came from the fields. Men, women, and children picked cotton, tobacco, or fruit together, bent under the sun. Pay was by the basket or pound, and there were no benefits, no safety nets. A good day's work meant food on the table. A bad one meant supper was thin. It was back-breaking labor, but it kept you alive. In small rural towns, a single phone line might serve half a dozen families. They called it a party line, and everyone could hear your business if they lifted the receiver. Folks learned to talk quick and polite, saving gossip for later. When the phone finally rang for you, it felt like an event. Privacy was rare, but connection still mattered. At school, children who qualified for free lunches got tickets to hand the cafeteria lady. Many kept them hidden until the last second, afraid other kids would see. The food was plain, meatloaf, peas, bread, but it was hot and filling. Some children looked forward to that meal all day. Hunger carried shame in those years, even when everyone knew the feeling. Some kids didn't make it through high school. When times got tight, they left early to help at home, working on farms and mills or washing dishes at the diner. Nobody called it dropping out. It was simply doing what had to be done. Pride came from earning, not grades. Education could wait. Bills couldn't. Those choices shaped whole families for generations. For many mothers, side jobs were a quiet lifeline. They scrubbed floors, took in laundry, or mended clothes for neighbors, earning a few dollars a week. The work was steady, but unseen, just enough to cover groceries or a doctor visit. They rarely complained. In small towns, everyone knew who worked hardest, and most of the time, it was the mothers holding it all together. In the cities, poverty looked different, but felt the same. Tenement apartments had cracked walls, leaky pipes, and bathrooms shared between families. Rats scurried in hallways at night, and plaster flaked from the ceilings. Yet children still played in stairwells, and neighbors watched out for one another. The buildings were crumbling, but community filled the cracks where money couldn't. When money was tight, families doubled up. 2, sometimes 3 generations shared one apartment. Mattresses lined the floor and curtains hung where walls should have been. It wasn't ideal, but it was home. Grandparents helped with the kids, uncles picked up groceries, and everyone shared what little they had. Crowded or not, those rooms were full of life and survival. Pawn shops were the poor man's bank. When rent came due, people carried in what they could spare: tools, a watch, maybe a radio. The pawnbroker counted bills slowly, handed over a few worn dollars, and slipped the item into the back room. You always hoped to buy it back, though sometimes you didn't. It was a painful cycle, but it kept you afloat. Small-town grocers often kept handwritten ledgers behind the counter. Families ran a bill until payday. You could walk in, buy bread and milk, and say, "Put it on my tab." No contracts, no cards, just trust. When Friday came, you paid what you could, and they'd smile and write, "Paid partial." It was dignity in poverty, the quiet credit system of small-town America. Shoes were a luxury. Most kids went barefoot all summer, saving their good pair for school and Sunday church. The hot pavement toughened their feet, and stubbed toes were part of growing up. By September, new soles smelled like hope. Parents patched worn ones with cardboard until payday. It wasn't neglect. It was resourcefulness, the kind learned only when money's tight. At Christmas time, charity barrels showed up in stores and churches. Inside were used toys, fruit, and sometimes a few pieces of candy. For children in poor families, those small treasures felt like magic. Parents pretended they came from Santa, keeping the illusion alive. It wasn't about what you got. It was about knowing someone somewhere cared enough to share. Churches quietly filled the gaps that government aid couldn't. Food drives, clothing closets, and free suppers were organized without much talk. Families lined up in fellowship halls with humility and gratitude. Ministers never asked too many questions. They just handed over what was needed. Faith and community were the safety net for the poor, woven together with quiet compassion. Teenagers often worked before or after school, pumping gas, delivering papers, or bagging groceries. Most of that money went straight home to help with bills. $1 here, $1 there. It mattered. They learned the value of work early, not as a lesson, but as a necessity. There wasn't much leisure, but there was pride in knowing you pulled your weight. When factories or mills shut down, churches stepped in quietly. Ladies in aprons served hot casseroles and soup in the fellowship hall, and no one asked for names. Sometimes sacks of groceries were left on doorsteps with no note attached. These small acts of grace kept towns afloat. Nobody called it charity. It was just neighbors helping neighbors through another hard spell. When farms failed and banks came calling, families packed everything they owned into a pickup truck. Chickens, furniture, and children all piled together. They'd drive toward a new start, though most didn't know where that would be. Losing land wasn't just losing money. It was losing history, pride, and identity. Those dirt roads saw more heartbreak than any banker ever did. In many poor southern neighborhoods, roads stayed unpaved well into the 1960s. Rain turned them to ruts and mud, and dust hung in the air come summer. Street lights were few, so nights fell pitch black, except for the glow from porches. Kids played barefoot among strayed dogs and tin cans, and yet laughter still filled those dark, unpaved streets. Old men too frail to work often gathered bottles and scrap metal, dragging sacks behind them. They'd trade the load for a few coins, enough for bread, a can of beans, maybe a pack of cigarettes. They walked slow but steady, never asking for pity. Pride was a fragile thing, but in those years, it was often the only possession left. When the furnace broke, families turned to open ovens or kerosene heaters for warmth. Children huddled close to the glow, careful not to touch. Frost gathered on window panes, and mothers laid quilts along the floor to block drafts. Heat became a shared effort, blankets piled high, breath visible in the air. Winter tested everyone, but so did pride, and both were survived. For mothers on welfare, help came with whispers. At the grocery store or church, people would lower their voices when the topic came up. It wasn't easy taking government aid. Many tried to hide it. Yet those checks paid the rent and fed the children. The judgment was heavy, but hunger was heavier. Most just did what they had to do. In small towns, county doctors were the last safety net. They'd patch you up for free or take payment in chickens, vegetables, or whatever you could spare. No one kept strict books. Trust filled the gaps money couldn't. A doctor's visit wasn't just medicine, it was mercy. Those country doctors kept whole communities going when times were thin and wallets were empty. Poor children learned to make fun out of whatever they could find. A tin can became a toy car, sticks turned into baseball bats, and old tires became rolling games down hills. Store-bought toys were a dream, but imagination was free. The laughter sounded the same as anywhere else. Poverty didn't take away childhood. It just made it more inventive. After President Johnson declared the War on Poverty in 1964, volunteers from new federal programs showed up in forgotten towns with notebooks and cameras. They went door to door asking questions, documenting bare cupboards and dirt floors. Some families hoped it meant help was finally coming. Others just stared warily, used to promises that never arrived. Poverty didn't vanish. It just became visible. For those lucky enough to have a television, Johnson's speeches about the Great Society filled the screen in black and white. He talked about fairness and opportunity, while families sat on threadbare couches wondering if any of it would reach them. Those without TVs heard about it secondhand on the radio or from a neighbor. Hope traveled slowly in those days. Migrant workers spent the 1960s chasing harvests across America. They packed families into dusty trucks, sleeping in roadside camps without water or restrooms. Children picked fruit alongside parents for pennies a basket. When one crop ended, they moved to the next. The miles blurred together, but the work never stopped. It was a life lived between fields, with no roots and little rest. Sharecroppers' children knew hard work before they could spell it. From sunrise to sunset, they picked cotton or tended fields that never seemed to pay enough. By harvest's end, the landlord's share left little behind. The cycle kept families tied to the same patch of land for generations. It wasn't quite slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. It was survival on credit. Mothers often skipped their own meals so their kids could eat seconds. They'd smile and say they weren't hungry, pretending to sip coffee while watching plates empty. It was an unspoken sacrifice, repeated across thousands of kitchens. In those moments, love outweighed hunger. The mothers of the 1960s might not have had much, but they gave everything they could. Some children came to school with empty stomachs and empty lunch boxes, pretending they weren't hungry. They'd tell friends they already ate when they hadn't. Teachers noticed, sometimes slipping extra rolls or milk their way. It was quiet compassion in an era that didn't talk much about poverty. Pride kept mouths shut, but kindness spoke loudly in little acts like that. Charity health clinics were lifelines for the poor. Once a week, volunteer doctors offered free checkups, eyeglasses, and vaccines for children. Lines stretched down the block, mothers waiting patiently with kids in tow. There were no appointments, just hope. The care was simple, but it mattered. For many, those visits were the only medical attention they'd get all year long. Banks in small towns didn't hand out loans easily. If you didn't own land or property, you were out of luck. Steady work wasn't enough. Collateral was king. Families learned to rely on store tabs, neighbors, or prayer. A signature meant nothing if you had no savings. In the 1960s, poverty often meant being invisible to the people holding the pens. Junkyards often doubled as playgrounds for poor children. They climbed over old car frames, swung from doors, and collected shiny bits of metal like treasure. Parents warned them to be careful, but there weren't many safer places to play. Out of rust and rubble, kids built worlds of their own. It wasn't safe, but it was childhood all the same. In rural America, the mailman was more than a deliveryman. He brought welfare checks, Social Security payments, and sometimes even surplus food coupons. Families waited for him like clockwork, waving from porches when the truck pulled up. Some weeks, his arrival meant groceries. Other weeks, just another stack of bills. Either way, that rumbling mail truck carried a town's fragile hopes. The hum of sewing machines filled many poor kitchens. Mothers mended jeans, stitched quilts, and made dresses from flour sacks. Patterns came from memory, not magazines. Fabric scraps were too precious to waste. Each piece told a story of necessity turned to art, of love stitched into every seam. Those homemade clothes weren't stylish, but they were durable and made with pride. When a window shattered in winter, replacement glass wasn't always an option. Families nailed up cardboard or tin sheets, sealing the gaps with rags. The wind still found its way in, whistling through the cracks at night. But it kept the snow out, and that was what mattered. Poor homes weren't perfect, but they were warm with effort and determination. Nothing in a poor household was ever thrown away. Every jar, string, button, and nail was saved in a tin or drawer just in case. Coffee cans held bolts, jelly jars stored screws, and old shirts became cleaning rags. Waste was a luxury people couldn't afford. The art of getting by meant turning yesterday's scraps into tomorrow's solutions. Many elderly folks lived on Social Security checks so small they could barely cover groceries. Some rented rooms in relatives' homes, trading stories for board. Others spent their days on porches, careful with every dime. Retirement wasn't about leisure. It was about surviving another month. Yet many faced it with quiet grace, grateful to still have a roof and family nearby. In poor neighborhoods, kids often pooled coins to buy one shared treat, a comic book, a soda, or a pack of gum. They'd take turns reading or passing it around, making it last as long as possible. Sharing was second nature when nobody had much. Those small moments of joy carried more weight than money ever could. For all the hardship, most poor families carried themselves with remarkable pride. They kept homes tidy, clothes pressed, and manners polished. They didn't want pity. They wanted respect. Gratitude came easy. Bitterness came slow. Life wasn't fair, but it was lived with grace. Looking back, their quiet strength might be the richest thing they ever owned.